of you might have heard already, but Ineos Project 1 has been cut in half. One of the two major installations that Ineos is planning to build in the port of Antwerp has been put on hold indefinitely. Andy will get into why and how that is at the end of his presentation, and you surely can ask more questions about it in chat. But we'll get back to that. We're of course excited that this has happened, that we have made some progress, but the fight is not done. We are still trying to stop this entire extremely polluting project from becoming a reality. And we hope to see any and all of you involved in that as well. Now, without further ado, Andy has asked to introduce himself, so I will give word to him. So, Andy, go for it.
Yeah, thanks a million, Tom. Thank you all for being here, and thanks for the invitation. My name is Andy Gheorghiu, and I work as a freelance campaigner and consultant. And over the past 8 years, I've focused mainly on fracking, gas-related issues, liquefied natural gas. But it's now over 3 years ago, while supporting a campaign in the UK, I've bumped into Ineos, who were the main driving force behind fracking and shale development in the UK at that time. And I've soon realized that with this company, something is different. And the difference was that they didn't want to frack in order to contribute to the energy supply of the United Kingdom, although this was what they were telling. They wanted to frack in order to keep the control over the supply chain for their petrochemical industry. And this was new to me. So I've opened up the door to a complete new universe, got in touch with people working on plastics. And this is also how I came across the announcement that Ineos wants to invest at Antwerp. And this was the starting point of me getting in touch with local activists at Antwerp some 2 years ago. And here we are 2 years later with quite some development, despite the fact that there are these major forces behind this project. And so I was invited to give a presentation and to give you all a bit of an overview with regard to who Ineos is, where they're coming from. And so you can have a better glimpse of who the company is, who the owner is. And I'm going to start with this picture, which is kind of like the story in a nutshell. What you see here is one of the 8 so-called dragon ships of Ineos. Ineos commissioned an extra class of vessels for them, and they serve only one purpose, to carry frack gas from the United States to Europe in order to feed the petrochemical facilities of Ineos, and mainly in order to produce so-called virgin plastics. And that's exactly what they're planning for Antwerp. And what you see here is a puffin, an endangered animal, but you'll find quite a large puffin population in the Firth of Forth, which is in Scotland. And the Firth of Forth ends basically at Grangemouth, which is another major petrochemical cluster that Ineos owns. And what scientists have found out was that these birds, they do eat the plastic pellets that are being lost in their millions to billions, spilled into the environment as part of a structural problem that the industry has and that Ineos also has. The same problem occurs at Antwerp, by the way, and I'm going to show you some pictures later on. Okay, let's get started. Before we zoom into Ineos, I want to touch briefly upon the plastics industry as such, and also touch upon the role of the petrochemical industry and their impact on climate change, because I think this is something that is not widely known, but this industry plays a huge role, an important role, and as of now, their role within the whole climate change debate is hidden. So whatever this industry does goes under the radar. So it's really important to drag them into the light and to focus on them as one of the major contributors of global warming. Luckily, with plastics, we now have a product that can function as the ugly face of global warming or climate change. Quite often we do have this debate and it's a bit abstract, but with plastics, you can really touch, you can really see global warming, and then you'll have, in addition to that, you'll have the plastic waste problem in the environment that is visible. Starting with the distribution of plastics production, this graph here shows you that Europe, although production is in decline, still plays a major role in a global context. Of course, Asia is the producer number one, with, in actual fact, China being the huge part in this 51%. And then shortly after NAFTA, or almost the same with NAFTA, which includes Canada, the USA, and also Mexico, comes Europe. And for you guys, it's also important to know, because second to Houston, it's Antwerp as the biggest petrochemical cluster in the world. So you see, distribution-wise, Europe is still a major player in the plastics world. And in terms of share of plastics, we often hear, and Ineos also plays this game, that the plastics will go into wind turbines or high-quality plastics, or that we can't live without all these plastic products. And it's in part true. So plastics, they played a role contributing to some goods of our society. We can't deny that. But when we look at the contribution and the share of plastics, we start to realize that roughly 40% goes into packaging, and that's exactly the problem. So yes, we need to talk about all these other sectors as well, but this is the sector that produces most of the plastics that is not really needed, to be honest. Going to petrochemicals as such, and going to their role as a climate change contributor, I can only recommend you guys to read The Future of Petrochemicals, published by the International Energy Agency, published in 2018, which gives you quite a good overview into petrochemicals as such. You'll start to realize that there are two major sectors within petrochemicals. One is fertilizers, and the other major sector is plastics. And then, keeping in mind what I've just said, within the plastics universe, it's packaging who has the major share. And in terms of oil and gas consumption, I was also surprised to realize that petrochemicals are, as a single sector, the largest consumer of global oil and gas. Already as of today, the consumption of petrochemicals in terms of oil is 14%. And this would include, by the way, ethane, or what the industry called natural gas liquids, or wet gas, and 8% of gas primary demand. These are global numbers. When we say gas in this case, this is methane. And in order to understand that, in some geological layers, you'll find both. You'll find the so-called dry gas component, which is methane, and you'll find the so-called wet gas components, which are ethane, propane, and butane. And they are called natural gas liquids. And the industry the petrochemical industry can use methane to either power their very energy intensive facilities or to produce fertilizers. So they can use methane as a feedstock to produce fertilizers. With regard to natural gas liquids, that's ethane, propane, and butane, these are the feedstocks that go into plastics production. And this is what Ineos is after. So huge contribution to global warming through their large consumption of oil and gas. And the IEA expects that the consumption will grow, and B, that cheap ethane consumption will grow by 70% until 2030. And that's also in part due to the expansion of US exports to regions such as Europe. And there's one major player in this game, and it's Ineos. Now, before we finally go and talk about Ineos, one last slide about the petrochemical role and the plastics role with regard to climate change. And these numbers are from a report published by the Center for International Environmental Law in 2019. And according to their numbers, and these are pretty conservative numbers, if we pay attention to the full life cycle of plastic, meaning that we start from the well, where they extract the oil and gas, transport, the production, incineration, or the decaying waste in the environment, which also releases methane, by the way, this full life cycle could generate 56 gigatons of CO2 emissions by 2050. And this is as much as 10 to 13% of our entire remaining carbon budget for a 1.5 global warming scenario. So again, a huge impact, a very significant role, and we need to talk about this connection. Now, Ineos. Ineos is the #1 producer of ethylene in Europe, with a production capacity of roughly 3 million tons of ethylene. And they're #3 or 2, depending on the year, of propylene, with a production capacity of roughly 1 million tons. And Ineos was created and is still being owned by basically one man. His name is Jim Ratcliffe. He's a multi-billionaire, one of the richest, if not, meanwhile, the richest man in the United Kingdom. And this is also something that is very unique with regard to Ineos, who are, by the way, amongst the top 5 petrochemical companies worldwide. In this case, everything that this company does, every direction it steers, it's in the hands of one man. With the other companies, you'll have a board, you'll have larger stakeholders, and so on and so forth. You'll be able to influence maybe some major decisions of the company from the outside. Sorry, but with Ineos, you'll have to basically convince Jim Ratcliffe to go in this direction or that direction, and he's completely perspective in terms of vision and future, not only for Ineos, but for the petrochemical industry in Europe as a whole, is completely past orientated, because every investment he makes has nothing to do with what we all have to do, which is to heavily invest in some true alternatives and try to engage in this transition period, which is not very long, if we're honest. If we're lucky, maybe 30 years, if not, maybe only 10. So Jim Ratcliffe owns 62% of Ineos, and then there are 2 other guys, Andrew Carey with roughly 20, and the other one is a guy called John Rees with 90%. And what you see is that Ineos is not one company, but dozens of companies with a very complex structure. But the key message here is that the core company is a company named Ineos Limited, and they are based on the Isle of Man, which is a tax haven, surrounded by companies that are headquartered in Switzerland, also because of apparently tax reasons. And that's also a main theme for Jim Ratcliffe. He's known for constantly complaining about green taxes, regulations, and so on and so forth, and also known to to actually go to places where he doesn't have to pay a lot of taxes, while at the same time he tries to gain access to public subsidies wherever he wants to invest. So this slide here tells you the history of Ineos, basically. You don't have to pay attention to every detail. I just go to the main decisive points in the life cycle of Ineos, and it starts at Antwerp. It starts in 1998, where Jim Ratcliffe, who actually came from the financial world, bought a company named Inspec, and this is the birthplace of Ineos. 1998, bought Inspec for £91 million, but then grew relatively fast. In actual fact, just 1 year later, he paid roughly £500 million for a company named ICI. It was a major British petrochemical company. So a huge step, 91 million in 98, and then just 1 year later, £500 million for ICI. But the main thing happened in actual fact in 2005 when he bought Inovine from BP for £5.1 billion, which required, in actual fact, almost the same amount of money in bank loans. And this is also the reason why Ineos still owns Grangemouth. So through Inovine, he got ownership of Grangemouth at Scotland. Now, in 2008, we had, of course, the financial crisis and markets were shaking. And so was Ineos, because at that time, the debt hovered at roughly £7 billion, and they had to pay almost £700 million in fees to banks. And this is the time when Jim Ratcliffe had to either close down assets, or he had to come up with some kind of new idea, a perspective, in order to convince his investors and banks to put more money into a company that was almost bankrupt. So this is when he came up with the idea of switching from naphtha, which is crude oil, as a feedstock, to frack gas. The reason for that had to do with the fact that the fracking industry in the United States operated and still operate in a closed market, meaning that you have an oversupply, prices are dropping, and in some geological layers, like the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania, you'll also have a high percentage of or share of natural gas liquids within the geological layer. Now, for a long time, there was no real market for these byproducts. So what the industry wanted was the methane. They weren't so much interested in the ethane, propane, and butane. But all of a sudden, starting 2010, the petrochemical industry in the United States started to heavily invest into new petrochemical facilities because they had more or less this huge storage of natural gas liquids and no market for it. And Jim Ratcliffe saw this wave coming, so he decided to provide this perspective of switching from naphtha to frack gas. And by that, he also came up with a plan of commissioning this extra class of ships that will be then able to transport basically the frack gas from the United States to Europe. And he also contracted with two US companies. One is Range Resources, who would be then doing the actual drilling in Pennsylvania. The other one is called Sunoco, and they are engaged in a project called Mariner East Pipeline, a pipeline that aims at transporting the hydrocarbons, the frack gas, from the fracking boreholes to the export terminal in Pennsylvania, where Ineos will pick them up and transport them to Europe. I'll show this in a minute. But this is a time between 2008 and 2010 where he came up with this plan and started to or convinced basically lenders to give him more money so that he was able to invest. Someone is not unmuted, so I can hear some background noise. At the same time, the other move that he made, and this time, was he removed his headquarters from Britain to Switzerland, as I've already outlined, because he wanted to save taxes. And he started also the construction of a huge ethane storage tank at Grangemouth, for which he received £230 million from the British government. And this was also a period like between 12 and 15 where Ineos started to transform from a more or less pure midstream to downstream producer of plastics and petrochemicals to an upstream producer of oil and gas. So in 2015, they bought 12 North Sea gas fields. By 2016, the first ship arrives at Roughness, which is in Norway. This is another cluster where Ineos has facilities that are being supplied with fracked gas. And in 2017, he also buys all the oil and gas upstream assets from a Danish company named Dong, and buys also the Forties pipeline system, which can supply 40% of the UK's North Sea gas and oil, and is also a hub for Brent crude oil benchmark. So he has quite a nice tool in his hands, in actual fact, Jim Ratcliffe, because whatever happens at the Forties pipeline system, it will have an immediate impact on the Brent oil price globally. The same year, they also announced that they will invest £1.6 billion in all their petrochemical plants, and this would include building the biggest butane storage tank at Antwerp in Belgium. Now, unfortunately, at that time, I was focusing on the UK and tried to stop fracking there and support the groups there. So we didn't pay much attention to what was going on at Antwerp. And I must tell you that construction on this butane storage tank was accomplished in October 2020. So this butane storage tank is now operational. But then, of course, and you know the story, 2 years later, they finally announced that they will build the two facilities at Antwerp, the ethane cracker and the PDH unit that was now cancelled. And what also happened, this was last year, they bought the complete petrochemical business from BP for $5 billion. And this is quite significant because we're talking about up to 25% of the overall BP assets. So while BP, and I don't want to make them saints here, but while BP is kind of like trying to do some kind of transition and is getting rid of all the old dirty business, so to say, Ineos is still engaging in what they've always did, buy off shit and shite that no one else wants, past-orientated fossil fuel-based shit and shite, try to refurbish it and just basically do business as usual. But unfortunately, or fortunately for us, cracks start to appear in this picture of Ineos. And so we saw not only for Ineos, but we saw for the whole oil and gas business that the profits are plunging. And for the company itself, it's a bit back to square one, I would say. So I've outlined that in 2008 that they carried huge debt with them. This is a cutting out of their annual report 2019, and you can read that they themselves talk about significant indebtedness and that they had consolidated loans and borrowings of roughly 7 billion euros. So I do strongly believe that, you know, with every step that Ineos can't move forward, that this will backfire into their very fragile company system. Now, zooming out again, and trying to get the overall picture of the supply chain, this is, in actual fact, this is their supply chain. So here's Pennsylvania. This is where the fracking rigs are. We saw a major industrialization there within a decade. In 2005, there were barely a handful of wells operating in Pennsylvania. And within 10 years, we're talking over 10,000 fracking wells, just to give you some dimension. This is the pipeline. There's one existing pipeline, an old one, that needs to be expanded, but Sunoco is also in the construction of a second pipeline. And these pipelines or this project, they do serve only one purpose, and that's to keep the supply chain of Ineos alive. And whenever there's a problem here in Pennsylvania, and you can watch this live if you use marinetraffic.com and just track their ships. Whenever there's a problem here, Ineos will then export from Houston, and the main supply chain goes to, and I've mentioned this before, to Grangemouth or Roughness. Now, of course, there will be more and more shipments coming into Antwerp now that the butane storage tank is operational. And they do have further plans to also feed their petrochemical facilities at Cologne. You have to keep in mind that this whole section here in Europe is called the Antwerp, Rotterdam, Rhine-Ruhr petrochemical cluster. This is a huge cluster in Western Europe. And Ineos is one, if not the major player in this whole supply chain. Now, let's have a look just a bit, some snippets at what this really means. I mean, this is a nice overview graph, okay? But what does this mean for the people living on the ground? And with regard to Pennsylvania and the construction of this pipeline, it's huge. The partner of Ineos was fined several times during the construction because up to this day, we have a series of continuous accidents. And I mean, really, it just goes on and on and on. I'm just going to show you just some articles. And back in, this is from 2018. This was the largest single fine ever announced by the Department of Environment of Pennsylvania, 12.6 million. This is related to ongoing accidents, violations against environmental health safety issues. But this didn't stop Sunoco from continuing the work. So there you go, another 300,000. This is an article from 2019. Another 2 million fine. This is from January last year, lake spill. Another $200,000 fine, also from February 2020. And the overarching issue in this whole scenario is that the FBI is now investigating, actual fact, Governor Wolf's administration's issuing of the Marina East pipeline permits. And the fun factor is that Ineos tried to intervene whenever construction was put on hold, and there's a letter that was published by a Scottish outlet named The Ferret, an original letter from Ineos written to the Pennsylvania authorities, basically saying, please let this guy continue to construct a pipeline, you know, not mentioning with one word what this means for the people impacted, and then basically saying if they're not able to finish this project, this will have an impact on our assets in Europe. So there's a direct connection, and there's the weakest point for Ineos, I would say, at the moment is their strong reliance on frack gas. If they can't have access to cheap frack gas, I think that this would cause a problem for Ineos in the long run. And please keep in mind that the new ethane cracker at Antwerp will be or is also 100% reliant on frack gas. Since and also to demonstrate their reliance on frack gas as such, through the strong opposition in Scotland and England, Ineos plans to develop shale were crossed in the UK. So we have a strong moratorium in Scotland right now. We have a weaker one in England, which might prove critical, but anyhow, they've been stopped for the time being. They're still the owner of the licenses though, but they've been stopped. And as soon as they weren't able to develop shale in the UK, they've announced that they will now start to frack in Texas. And this also indicates that they're really desperate to keep control over this whole supply chain, also desperate to have access to frack gas. Now switching over to Europe, when you look at all their existing petrochemical facilities, there's none without a very dire environmental track record, also in terms of pollution, and especially at Grangemouth. They've been ranked or classified worst polluter for Scotland several times, happened recently again. And the other thing that is, and I've mentioned it in the first slide, the other thing that is really significant, because it's not seems to be, but is structural for the industry apparently, because they can't stop it or are not willing to stop it, is the plastic pellet pollution problem. You have the same in Antwerp. So what you see here are plastic pellets in the Firth of Forth in Scotland, and this is along, you know, the Firth of Forth that will end up at the Grangemouth facility. Ineos, of course, says this has nothing to do with us, but nonetheless, through publications and through opposition, pressure is rising to do something against the plastic pellet pollution. The only solution that they offer is they've joined a greenwashing ocean clean sweep initiative, but this was set up by the industry itself years ago. And it basically says, you know, educate your workers not to lose plastic pellets, which is a bit of a, you know, a joke in actual fact. As a not responsible, but as a producer of a product, you shouldn't be forced to sign up to a program that says educate your workers not to lose your product. So ocean clean sweep sounds nice, but doesn't do anything really. So again, same problem at Antwerp. Great article by Tina Hans in the Mondial News. And these are pictures that I took myself in the port of Antwerp. This is in a protected Natura 2000 site in Europe. And I've sent the pictures. I've sent my papers and statements to EU Commission officials. Nothing happened so far. And this is something that we really need to amplify. I mean, it's bad enough that they're losing their plastic pellets, but they're losing them in protected areas. If any of us would go to a protected area and basically dump their rubbish there, we will be fined or jailed or whatever. And it is unacceptable that this industry does this on a regular basis and basically goes away with climate and environmental murder. And the ethane cracker and any new facility in the port of Antwerp will increase the already existing problem because, and repeat myself here, this is a structural problem that the industry is not willing or not capable to solve. And nonetheless, and that's one of the many fun factors within the Ineos universe, nonetheless, they've opted for this slogan for their new ships that will be then carry raw materials from Antwerp to Cologne. Keep our rivers clean, as if they had nothing to do with it, with the pollution. But because of all that, there's opposition everywhere along the supply chain. This is a picture from, I think it's Antwerp or Brussels. Here's one from a protest in Yorkshire. This is from Brussels when we protested during the Tour de France 2 years ago. This one is from London. These are pictures from people opposing the Marine East pipeline. That's a lovely girl. That's the Greta Thunberg of Manchester, where we had an action also last year. And here are some of you guys who did this great action last year. And there you have it. These are the results. These are the victories that you can rightfully claim so far. One thing that happened because of a legal action, the permit was rejected for the deforestation, meaning that project one as such might be delayed by at least a year or so. And then the other thing that happened recently, and Tom mentioned it at the beginning, they had to announce that they would, in their words, put the PDH unit on hold. But I was told that apparently they've fired the whole team. So it looks more like as if half of project one, which I like to refer to as project none, is halfway through. And I think if we keep pushing, then we will be successful. And then one last slide to have some kind of future perspective, or to see where Ineos is now trying to flee. And there are two major issues, and that's not only Ineos, but the industry as a whole, because they don't have many alternatives, many solutions in actual fact. So one field where they're trying to flee is hydrogen. And the other thing is CCS, carbon capture storage. Although CCS failed many times over the last 10 years, and although we still lack a worldwide hydrogen infrastructure or production infrastructure based on 100% renewables, but that's kind of like the last slide that I want to show, just to pitch it for some discussion point. So having said that, I think that we're doing a great job, and I think that the most important thing in this whole fight is that people have started to connect along the supply chain, and this has proved very successful. So thank you for your attention, and now I'm ready to receive questions.
Thank you, Andy, for the presentation. I'm going to check our sheet. I have one question here. Is it right that the biggest part of, or the majority of plastics are still getting burned? Is massive recycling a solution to this problem of plastic waste, in your opinion?
So I must admit, I am an upstream guy in the plastics world. I know that in Germany, for example, when China announced that they won't receive any plastic rubbish from Europe, that 60% of plastics went into incineration. I don't have the figures worldwide and don't have them specific for Belgium. But recycling might be a solution, but there are major problems related to recycling, also pollution problems. So if recycling could help to reduce the problem, but for me personally, the problem is first and foremost supply driven, as I've tried to outline. So we must stop the tap, we must stop the wells producing oil and gas, because as long as they produce oil and gas, these guys will find ways to make plastics out of oil and gas. And on the demand side, we must stop to use nonsense plastic, like single-use plastics. And then in the meantime, we can sit together and see if there are any sustainable recycling solutions that we can do to deal with the waste that is already in the environment.
Talking about waste, Marek makes an interesting analogy. In Antwerp, there is this big plan of the government to encapsulate the entire highway that goes around the city, a project that will cost a lot of money. Is there a way to stop these factories from losing their plastic pellets into our river, encapsulating them somehow, encapsulating the process of or the transportation system somehow, or is there always are they always doomed to lose that plastic in our river?
You know, I kind of like, I don't know, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering why there is this massive problem. I personally think from experience in other fields that they could definitely do a better job, but apparently it's cheaper for them to just, accept the spillages and kind of like the loss of some of their products instead of implementing some measurements or forcing maybe even their own suppliers or the people they're selling their plastics to use closed lorries. So apparently, as of now, it's cheaper to just lose a bit of the product instead of trying to find a solution to not have these pillages. I'm quite confident that they could do a much better job. But in actual fact, even if we will stop plastic pellet pollution, there's no room for new plastic pellet production, because we have to keep in mind that these facilities, they have an economic lifespan of 30 to 50 years, maybe 70 years, depending on how they calculate. And this is way beyond 2050, when we need to be at net zero. So
Mm-hmm.
in particular, this investment of Ineos is an investment that is not in line with our obligations under the Paris Agreement, the new climate targets in Europe, which are much higher, and also not in line with the already enshrined single-use plastics directive that will, in actual fact, also force member states to phase out some single-use plastics. So there's no justification, from my point of view, how you can justify such an investment as of now, even if you would be able to solve the plastic pellet pollution problem.
Let me play devil's advocate there. A common argument used by Ineos would be that this installation is a more efficient, a more technologically advanced installation. It is it is prepared to install carbon capture, they say. The old ones aren't. So isn't this because you admit that we still need a certain amount of plastics for certain things, like let's say hospitals or construction work? Isn't it better that Ineos builds this more technically advanced version of their machines?
Coming back to the argument that I've used before, we already have a production that sufficiently feeds plastic markets in Europe. So if the industry wants to do something, they should engage in upgrading their existing facilities and into providing a proper fossil fuel phase-out plan. Because otherwise, they will, not only we all collectively will do two things: either create a fossil lock-in or create stranded assets. And some of these stranded assets will have received subsidies, meaning what? You lose at least thrice as a citizen. You lose the public subsidy that could have gone into another project that is really orientated at the energy transition. Then you lose the stranded asset when it goes bankrupt, and then you risk that these guys come after you and might claim compensation because you've provided them with a perspective by pumping public money into this project. So I think that there is enough plastic out there, and there's again no room for any new fossil fuel based petrochemical facility. And one last point, even if the facility itself will produce, Swiss air out of the furnace, you'll have to keep in mind that it's about the emissions of the full supply chain. And this is in actual fact something that even the EU Commission is now forced to look into the full life cycle emissions of fossil fuels coming into Europe, but also into the full life cycle emissions of new facilities. And we have enough scientific evidence that clearly shows shale gas and oil contribute significantly to global warming. So any new facility based on frack gas, again, even if they will produce Swiss air on site, will have contributed massively to global warming.
Talking about, thank you, that was a very clear counter argument to something that we have heard repeated many times over. Do you know if there are any plans within Ineos to, for example, upgrade the site in Grangemouth or any other of its places to have any such plan of transition?
No, quite the contrary. In actual fact, I read an article that Jim Ratcliffe recently snubbed or just dismissed the net zero ambitions of the Scottish government and the Scottish Parliament. So to my knowledge, this doesn't happen. Another example is they had a plant at Teesside. This is not it's not an ethylene production site, but it was a petrochemical facility. The basic takeaway message there is they had to decide about whether or not they will invest 200 million euro into upgrading the facility in order to fulfill new environmental standards. Mm-hmm. And the decision of Ineos was to close down the plant because they wouldn't invest this money to comply with environmental regulations. And I think this gives you quite an answer.
Yes, thank you. I want to stay at Grangemouth and Ineos, its management of its facilities for a moment. What about Ineos's social reputation? Because you talk about environmental standards. What about the social reputation? Can you tell us a little bit more about what happened at Grangemouth a few years ago? Is it true that he preferred to completely close down the factory instead of yielding to the workers and their union? There was a major conflict there. Can you please go into that a little bit?
Yeah, so as I've said, they had to decide in the aftermath of the financial crisis if they want to close down assets or not. And then he came up with this idea, but this wasn't apparently enough. So what he also tried was to basically reduce pensions and wages, and this caused an uprise by the unions, and it was a major battle between the unions and Jim Ratcliffe. Unfortunately, he finally won with the consequences that he cut pensions and wages and tea breaks, and to kind of like give you some insight into the psychology of Ineos and Jim Ratcliffe in particular, he even produced a so-called documentary called The Battle for Grangemouth, where he basically shows off how he won over the unions. Unfortunately, I think it's 2 months ago, even all these measures, forcing unions to accept cuts in pensions and wages, new investments into all this frack gas reliant supply chain, all that didn't help from announcing recently that they'll have to shut down half of the production at the Grangemouth refinery, which means that 200 people will lose their jobs. And this is exactly something that we will, I would say, we will see in the coming years. And that's also the reason why petrochemical clusters of the 21st century must understand that they must look into what happened to former coal mining regions, and that they should start the transition period right now, because it can happen from one day to the other. You can have another pandemic, or all these efforts to really go into transition might lead to a point where all of a sudden, from one day to the other, companies like Ineos will close facilities. So we need to engage to have this transition, because we need to have a just transition. If we rely on promises of companies like Ineos and of guys like Jim Ratcliffe, then people will accept cuts in pensions and wages. They'll go into hard times, but then they'll wake up and finally realize that they will nonetheless lose their jobs. Maybe it will take another 2 or 3 years, but they will lose them.
Mm-hmm. To what extent, or let me ask you to look in the direction where we could be going. How many of those were 40-60% of plastics that aren't single use can we replace by environmental alternatives or durable alternatives? And how sure can we be that those won't end up being pollutants eventually as well? Is that a direction we could be going in?
Well, first, there are clear, targets set to reduce single-use plastics. This has to be implemented. There are, of course, now all these debates about, can we have bio-based plastics? And I think we should think of what is essential. And there is not one answer to that, I would say. Because it also has to do with what you can do locally. Like if you, let's say here in the small city where I live, some people have set up a plastic-free initiative. So they will look into what's possible here. How can we reduce our plastic consumption here? And I think it's not replacing packaging, fossil fuels packaging with something else. It's also reducing packaging in the first place. It's thinking about sustainable solutions. And if we think about sustainable solutions, there's always a problem when you talk about the same volumes. So let's say, to give an example, you would say 40% of existing packaging nowadays fossil fuel based. You do something bio based. Well, to have the same amount of plastic film, you would need to plant crops or whatever kind of bioorganic plants, and you'll need to have large plantations just to cut them down and to turn them into packaging, which will have, of course, major and huge environmental impacts. So I think size is really decisive, and the individual question of, do I really need this or not? And I cannot, unfortunately, I cannot give you the answer or the solution right now. What I can say, though, is I can only recommend to go to the Zero Waste Cities websites. There are also nationwide websites, and to go to the Break Free from Plastic Europe website, where you'll have some of the solutions outlined.
I'm sure somebody can link those in chat for the audience. Let's stay on that for a moment. If I hear you talk, I mean, I would almost agree with the traditional neoliberal argument. It is not economically feasible, they say. I mean, we can do this entire transition, but another country can start producing those plastic wrappings, and people are still going to buy them. And as you say, investing in the green alternative is extremely costly. It takes a lot of space, etc., etc. Is it economically feasible to get rid of those things?
The question is what you put into the equation of economics. Mm-hmm. And I think you'll have to start with a clear financial risk of having stranded assets, but also the impacts of climate change and global warming will backfire, and they cost, I mean, like real money. For the port of Antwerp and the port of Houston, in actual fact, already faces these issues. Flooding becomes more and more of an issue, and it's flooding because of rising sea levels. So if you put all the costs into the equation, I bet the economics look different. And I mean really everything, from dealing with the waste, from the incineration, air pollution. You'll have to put everything into the equation. It's easy to say that, oh, they'll go somewhere else. I, in actual fact, don't think that this is the case per se. Let's say we'll stop this investment here. I see this investment as a very symbolic one. So if we stop Ineos here, I assume that this will have a domino effect, first within Ineos, but also within the industry. It will be a clear signal that the industry needs to do something differently. As of now, they have quite an easy game. They are creating their own markets. They are, luring people into this idea that we cannot live without plastics, that there are no other solutions. But the actual fact is the earth is getting warmer. And this has actual real impacts, also in economic terms. And we have to put all these factors into the equation. And I assume we'll find out that it's much more economically viable to go and try find real solutions instead of doing business as usual, what these guys want.
How do we, because if you talk about the domino effect, but if these companies start falling, there is still that percentage of one-use plastics, throwaway plastics that we need. Because Peter mainly wanted to know about, can we replace those by ecologically friendly alternatives as well? Is there a possibility? Or are we just doomed to have a small amount of pollution there, or maybe a not so small amount of pollution?
That's a good question, and it's the question. But in actual fact, I have to excuse myself that I don't have the answer yet. And the reason for that is, again, I try to stop the upstream side, and I try to focus on the main problem, which is packaging for the time being. Mm-hmm. And I think it's healthy to go step by step. Why? Because if you'll engage with these guys in the overall debate, then they'll corner you and say, look, you see, you can't live without plastics. So we'll have to go after the problem that is there as of now. And the main problem is plastic waste because of single-use plastics. Let's solve this one. Let's stop new investments. Let's maybe even sit down with these guys and have a proper chat about what can be done and what can't be done. And then we'll also focus on how do we use other materials to produce our laptops or whatever.
Okay, thanks. Let's zoom in on Antwerp for a moment here. They say, like you said before, they claim, Ineos claims that Project 1 is delayed indefinitely, but is it delayed indefinitely, or is it just scrapped? Because we have heard of indeed people losing their jobs on that team, etc., etc.
Well, I'm not a prophet, but I see the articles, and I hear the voices behind the scenes, so I can only confirm what you've said. Ineos says it's put on hold, but apparently people have been fired. I think that they have realized they cannot compete with the other PDH unit by Borealis, which is underway, and so they're trying to save at least the ethane cracker. But in terms of impacts, I think the longer we can delay any kind of progress, the harder it will be for Ineos to proceed. And just keep in mind, you're not the only ones fighting the supply chain. There are other people still fighting the Mariner East pipeline. People in the UK, in Scotland and England, They're still watching what Ineos is doing. So there are many people who are fighting pieces of the Ineos supply chain. And I think all these efforts led to this decision by Ineos. So I would say, let's assume it's canceled, but let's nonetheless not think that we've won, as you've already said, especially
Remain
because,
vigilant.
the ethane cracker is also the much bigger part of the project.
Yeah, let's the ethylene cracker. What can we actually expect in terms of pollution from that installation? Besides the plastic pellets, what, for example, would it do in terms of air pollution? Antwerp is notoriously bad, one of the worst cities, I believe, in Europe in terms of air quality. What would it mean for our air quality?
Yeah, I don't think that it will improve the air quality on site. You'll have another polluting facility online that will, by the way, greenwash its pollution. Please keep in mind that the industry is operating under the European emissions trade system, which gives high polluters the allowances for free. I mean, I've bumped into this while I've started to investigate Antwerp and so on and so forth. And for me, it was a scandal that the highest polluters, that they get the allowances for free. The system was created with the aim or with the promise of, let's create a market. Whoever is the worst polluter must pay, more money to stay within the system. So we will push the highest polluters out of the market because they'll have to pay some high price, so they'll have to invest to pollute less. But in actual fact, and I repeat myself, they're getting the allowances for free. So at the end of the day, I don't think that the air quality will improve. And what we need, from my point of view, we need to force authorities to really demand a full life cycle climate impact assessment, a transboundary one. And we have in actual fact a legal hook within the existing environmental impact assessment directive at EU level. The only thing that happens, and I've seen it also in Germany related to other investments, authorities want to say, oh no, we cannot do that. Let's focus on the emissions on site and that's it. So if you engage, I mean, we hope that we'll never get to the point, but I would raise this issue. Whatever happens with the ethane cracker, you should demand that they'll have to provide a full life cycle assessment, and this will have to start at the fracking wells in Pennsylvania.
In terms of finance, you already mentioned that at one point Ineos was close to bankruptcy, and it had to convince a lot of people of its viability and its and why they should invest in that. But in Project One in the port of Antwerp, one of the major investors is the government itself in Belgium, or in Flanders, better. How is that relationship between Ineos and governments? How can it convince a government to invest so much in an industry that, as you point out, is kind of dying, or at least receiving more and more opposition and more questioning on the European level, for one?
I think this has to do with the fact that, unfortunately, some political decision makers are not willing to listen to all the arguments. They turn a blind eye to other serious sources of information. And when this happens, you can basically confront them with any kind of evidence. Also from a market perspective, they won't listen to you. So apparently they bought into the story of Ineos. But apart from that, as far as I remember, there was a competition between the port of Rotterdam and the port of Antwerp before Ineos decided to go to Antwerp. And apparently, there was involvement of high-level politicians in both cases. And then all of a sudden, Ineos decided to go to Antwerp. Why, we don't know. We've tried to get access to the memorandum of understanding, but never got the memorandum of understanding. And as you've outlined, there is at least the will to maybe also subsidize part of this project. It is and will be crucial, and I cannot tell you how you can do this, but it is crucial to convince political decision makers, the conservative ones, that there is, skip all these climate issues aside, okay, plastic pollution, whatever, but there is a high economic risk related to this project. In actual fact, IEFA is kind of like an NGO or a market analysis. They've published some stuff on this risk, the economic risk of plastics and petrochemicals. So maybe you can provide them with this background analysis, and maybe, I don't know if they're willing to join a webinar or whatever, that will focus on this high risk of basically creating a stranded asset, and then related to that will be the risk of losing the public subsidy. But I don't know if they will listen. I see the same stubbornness and ignorance in Germany as well. And sometimes arguments are not enough. Sometimes you'll have to force them to listen to you, which is not easy.
Can you repeat which organization writes about the risks?
It's IEFA, IEEFA.
Thank you.
I'm going to type it in.
I have a very specific question about Ineos here, but I'll in relationship to Rotterdam. But I have another question first about that competitiveness. After the announcement not to build a PhD unit, Ineos now refers to a growing demand on ethylene or of the ethylene market to explain why they plan to continue building that one. But isn't there also a structural overproduction there? Is that just not, is that also another like excuse of Ineos to?
It always depends how you look at it. The problem of last year was that the industry was clever enough to use the pandemic to sell plastics as something good. So HDPE, so ethylene as such, demand remains stable. But I think this is directly linked to the pandemic, and we need to, engage even further and confront their narrative that plastics is some kind of savior in this pandemic conditions. But they also think when they say that there's a growing need, what they have in mind is, of course, new markets such as Africa and so on and so forth. So from a global perspective, we also need a stronger engagement with countries that are just about to become bigger plastic markets. We are a quite mature market in Europe. I don't think that anything that will be produced here and contribute to an oversupply, I don't think that Europe will be the main market. I think these guys, they do think in 20, 30, 40 terms, and they do see Africa and other places of the world where they can sell a lot of plastics to a lot of people. So that's their perspective. But again, don't forget that, especially for Ineos, it all starts with, will they be able to get access to their cheap frack gas? And the fracking market struggles again in the United States. We had major write-offs, over $100 billion, and major bankruptcies in the United States because the industry is still operating in a closed market. So they'll also have to sell basically the story that, yeah, we need more ethylene, we need more frack gas, we need more plastics. Without this story, they won't be able to create markets. And without these markets, their existing industries will collapse at some point.
I'm going to go to America in a moment, but I have one specific question relating to Ineos and its competition between Antwerp and Rotterdam. Before coming to Antwerp, Ineos applied for the same permit in Rotterdam, another big petrochemical cluster, but they were unsuccessful because the Netherlands have set the bar at like 49% carbon reduction by 2030, while Belgium has a target of like 40%, but Flanders doesn't seem to completely align with that. This person has a very specific question, mainly, can we file a suit against the contract John Wood Group PLC that had the contract that they have secured with Ineos for its project to build a propane dehydrogenation PDH unit and the ethane gas cracker at the port of Antwerp, and on the basis of its commitment with the UN Global Compact. Could we legally oppose them there, that company, the John Wood Group PLC? They are a public limited UK-based energy service company, so you might know them. And they are also an active participant in the UN Global Compact, and have shown their commitment to reduce global carbon emissions by 40% by 2030.
That's a good question. I don't know. With all the lawsuits, you'll have to cherry pick very carefully which fight you go, because it costs a lot of money, it costs a lot of time. You'll have to find the right experts. You know, my gut feeling is go for the government, go for their climate obligations, try to get access to this memorandum of understanding, things like that. You know, going after a private company that isn't, or if you want to go after them, you know, outlining everything that you've said, maybe instead of filing a lawsuit, try to find ways how you can blame and shame, you know, what they're doing, and show the discrepancy between the commitments they're promoting and the engagement they are actually doing. So if you think about that, think carefully, because again, lawsuits cost a lot of money, and maybe if you find the right people, maybe some targeted lawsuit that will somehow say Flanders or Belgium, this investment is against, you know, or is not aligned with the binding climate targets, with the requirements of the Single-Use Plastics Directive, and trying to have something that, you know, a court decision within Flanders or Belgium might, you know, prove much more. And you'll have, the reason why I'm saying that is, when you go after a private company, it is related to this one project. But if you would go after the government and you would put forward the basic arguments, then you'll have, if it's in your favor, then you'll have a judgment that will not only apply to Ineos and their investment, but also to other companies and their investment. And it will be a judgment in general about the non-alignment of new petrochemical facilities and existing climate targets and the Single-Use Plastics Directive.
Okay, that sounds like great advice. There is, and I do want to also share that, there is also the climate case, Klimaatzaak, where a group of people and activists and environmental groups are suing the government. That is coming to a head this year, so maybe also pay attention to what happens there. It's been long enough in the making.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you can, I mean, if they're already progressed, but maybe you can get in touch with them and basically ask if they could also raise the petrochemical angle in relation to that. What I and others have tried to do, and I have to you know, open up a bit the discussion and say, there was a public consultation process related to the methane strategy and the methane regulation at the EU level. So the EU Commission finally admitted, oh, there's a problem with methane emissions. We're going to do something about it. what are we going to do? We want to do measurement, reporting, verifying. We want to do leakage detection and repair. But there was no clear indication about whether or not this will apply to petrochemicals. However, finally, we managed to get at least a line that says including feedstock, which would apply for petrochemicals. And yesterday we had the deadline for the methane regulation that will follow. And I've submitted something and focused on petrochemicals. So there is, and what I want to say is there is room for teaming up with people who are have filed or want to file climate lawsuits, and to engage with them and try to make them understand that petrochemicals are a huge sector, and at least from a narrative perspective, maybe they could mention that, you know, petrochemical sector also contributes a lot to global warming, and that they should also be investigated under all these lawsuits.
I'm checking the list of questions I have. Let's move to the US, because that's where the supply chain starts in the United States. The United States has just seen a major change of power with both houses of the Congress being in control of the Democrats and the presidency as well. What do you expect from the Biden administration in terms of their relationship to this entire petrochemical industry and the shale gas industry? As you said, it is completely government subsidized. Do you expect that to continue?
Well, the industry is not completely government subsidized, but there was a strong government support for the industry in terms of creating a legal framework that is nice for them to operate. And then, of course, Trump has, given public lands for fracking operations, and has also exempted companies recently from reporting methane emissions or reporting them as they would have had under under Obama and Biden. So, what do I expect from the Biden administration? If the U.S. folks will continue to put pressure on Biden and Harris, then we will definitely see an improvement there, maybe in terms of not giving licenses for fracking companies to operate on public lands, things like that. But apart from that, I do fear, and I've attended some events with the EU Commission members, but also with members from the German economy ministry. And there was a clear message already. And the message was, oh, Biden's coming in. Biden's going to regulate methane emissions. Everything will be fine. We're going to do a great job. We will expand our great relationship with our American friends. We will deal even more US LNG. So that's the danger that I see. And this is something that we need to pay attention to. So we need to keep an eye on that. And at the same time, we need to engage with US groups so that they, put pressure on the Biden administration. And in actual fact, I know the groups in the US that they're trying to reinforce the former existing LNG export ban. So the US had, in actual fact, a ban on exporting oil and gas under certain circumstances, and they've opened up. They got rid of this export ban, but this didn't happen under Trump. This happened under Obama, Biden. So careful with Biden. A lot of things will improve, but in our fight, we need to remain vigilant.
Okay, thank you very much. I believe that was the last of our questions. Andy, thank you very much for giving your presentation, answering our questions. Where can people find you if they want to follow you and hear more of you?
First of all, thanks a lot for the invitation. Thanks for your patience. Apologizes for not being able to answer all the questions, because completely accurately in terms of where are the solutions and so on and so forth. My apologizes is, even my brain has certain limitations.
No need to apologize.
In terms of where people can find me, I don't have a website, but you folks have my email address, and you can find me on Twitter. In actual fact, I can type in my Twitter tag here if you.
Yeah, do it. If people want to follow you on Twitter, I'm sure there will be some people that now are very interested. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Keep up the great work that you've done, that you're doing. And I mean, after all what happened, keeping in mind, the start of this whole campaign with just a handful of people, it's amazing what you've done. And I'm pretty hopeful that you'll able to stop Ineos.